Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Maartje.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 2 of Rosie the Reviewer, and today we are covering episodes 4 through 7 of Band of Brothers.
Yay!
Yeah, we're very excited because we just feel that, these are possibly the best episodes of the show, so
I agree. They didn't used to be my favorites, but now there's a couple of them.
right, they're pretty action-packed. Anyway, the recap.
Yes, I'm gonna do the recap, so bear with me. This episode is called Replacements, and it's about Easy Company's new guys who come in after they suffer a lot of losses in the first 3 episodes. And we follow a couple of them, namely Garcia Miller and Lester Heshy, as they try to fit in with Easy Company.
Yeah, and this is also the episode with not quite Bull's point of view, but we do have that side quest that he goes on when he ends up being trapped in the town and his guys come and rescue him.
He's the newbie guide in this episode.
Yeah, yeah. He's the looking after the newbies. I thought we might talk a little bit about what actually happened during Market Garden because I don't know about you, but I found that when I watched the show, I wasn't super clear about what was happening. And this is not one of the more famous operations, I would say, in terms of everyone's heard of D-Day and everyone's heard of the Battle of the Bulge, but this one kind of flies below the radar a little bit.
Yeah, that's probably because, for me, I know Market Garden because the Netherlands was a big part of Market Garden, but if you look at Easy Company, they're in Eindhoven, it's part of Market Garden, definitely, but it's not the most famous part of Market Garden, so what they do doesn't really influence the whole thing so much.
Yeah,
Take it
so
away,
Market
I'd
Garden
say.
was actually the largest airborne operation in history to date, which sounds impressive until you remember that they didn't really have an airborne because they didn't really have planes capable of that prior to World War II. But anyways, initially the plan was to go around the north end of the German defensive line. So the Germans had this series of fortifications called the Siegfried Line. But in order to do that, they would have to coordinate an attack on multiple bridges at the same time. And so Eisenhower, who was the Supreme Allied Commander, approved a huge allocation of Allied resources to have airborne divisions take the road bridges in strategic locations in the Netherlands behind the German lines and then hold those bridges open for a British advance in order to allow an invasion into northern Germany. And so it was kind of a two-parter. The airborne piece of it was called Market, and then the British advance was called Garden. So we have Market Garden. So in the show, we see Easy Company take Eindhoven, and there were some Allied successes, but unfortunately, the big ticket item was the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem. And that's where the Germans rallied and they were able to halt the advance. They destroyed bridges in some places. There ended up being significant casualties for the Allies, and the retreat was really messy. Some British and Polish paratroopers had to be rescued later, which we also see in the show. And what we don't see is that the Germans retaliated against the Dutch for that by cutting off food supplies, which caused thousands of Dutch people to die. And Arnhem actually ended up being taken by the Canadians, but not until the spring of 1945.
I live near Arnhem, so I know the story pretty well by now. And I didn't know so much about the market part of Market Garden until I went on tour again. So I learned a lot. But it's a big one and it's a big failure.
Yeah, definitely not a success, but they're not all going to be winners, I guess.
No. And they did win eventually, which is good.
Yeah, it's more important to win the war than the battle, I guess.
Except for all the people who died during Market Garden. But,
Right. And it
you
does
know,
seem I was doing a little bit of brushing up, and it does seem like there was part of the reason why it even happened was a little bit of a pissing contest between some of the different Allied commanders and people having different ideas of what would be the best way. Should we have a broad front? Should we have more of a narrow thrust? Should we do this? Should we do that?
with that in the back of our minds, we can have a look at the episode and kind of see where we start. And I actually know where we start because it starts with Easy Company jumping into Holland, into Son, which is actually where my grandma used to live. And I used to think that she lived there during the war, but she lived near Arnhem and was actually evacuated. So
Oh,
she could not have seen any of this jumping business.
oh, that's so interesting.
But I think it's really interesting that when the veterans start talking in the beginning of the episode, they kind of talk about like how the replacements were so fresh and so green that they didn't want to get to know them because they were afraid they were gonna die. Which is such a like Easy Company had been together for a good bunch of time, and then all these young guys came in. They didn't want to get to know them because they didn't want to be sad.
Right, which is grim. But I believe that Easy Company was sort of an exception. It was not common to have the same group of guys trained together for 2 years or whatever it was, and then all go into combat together. So they were really close. These are people they'd been hanging out with for a long time. And I think the show did a great job of casting the replacements because they look so young.
They do, especially James McAvoy looks like a tiny baby in this.
Literally a baby. Yeah, it's really good. And we see I wanted to talk about this. I really take issue with the depiction of Roy Cobb in this series because in real life, Roy Cobb seems like he was a good guy. So he's the one, if everyone remembers in the episode, who sort of razzes the replacements for wearing their pin for their company pin essentially to commemorate being at D-Day. And he's like, well, you weren't even at D-Day. And he technically wasn't either because he got hit in the plane. And in real life, he fought in North Africa before he joined the paratroops. And he had to be, I believe, evacuated back overseas. And then when he joined the paratroops, he was older than everyone else. He was 30-ish and apparently a super good natured guy. He actually got hit on the plane on D-Day, but he had given up his seat to George Luz because Luz was afraid and wanted to switch seats. And so it seems like a super chill, cool dude. And then the show is like, actually, he's a dick.
I do wonder though. I feel like maybe his character was maybe used to kind of portray that one guy in any company probably who wasn't as nice of a guy, and that's wrong. But I feel like it's the same kind of for Lester Hashi, who's a replacement who's kind of clumsy. And I wonder if I don't think they were either a dick or clumsy in real life, but
Yeah.
maybe they just used their character to show that there were people out there who weren't as nice or as good as at being a soldier.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is a way to kind of tie the narration together and tell those stories, but kind of does a disservice to the real people in some ways. You know what?
Yeah,
I stand by Show Cobb also, and I've said this before because while he is kind of a dick to the replacements, you got to think that here was a guy who trained for 2 years and then got hit in the plane and didn't even get to fight on D-Day. So then he
yeah,
comes
it's
back.
not his fault.
His buddies are treating him like he's a replacement, like he's brand new. He just got here. And, you know, when we see him kind of being a jerk later on in the series, he fought in North Africa and now he's been in Europe and he's just having a no good, very bad time. They keep sending these kids who are much younger than him, who are getting killed left, right, and center. And it's a lot. So, you know what? I'll stand by Show Cobb as well. Justice for Cobb all around.
I agree. I'm maybe not as passionate about it as you are, but I do agree.
I'll make you an honorary card so you can be an honorary member, card carrying member of the Roy Cobb Apologist Club.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
In this episode, we get a lot of interactions with civilians, which I think is really interesting. They obviously they're in the Netherlands, so these are friendly civilians. So we get them in the town with all the folks celebrating, and then a little later in the episode, we get I think Webster and Hubler interacting with that farmer and his kid. And it's just yeah, it's just kind of interesting to watch this kind of reaction to the Americans arriving.
Yeah, and also it's nice to see actual Dutch people in the show. Like, I feel like there's the farmer who meets Bull, and he's actually Dutch, and there's the resistance guy who's Dutch. And I think even like the farmer and his kid are also Dutch. But then when we enter Eindhoven in the celebrations, I'm pretty sure everyone in that scene is not Dutch. It's so funny
Call them out.
because they're singing the song, and I'm not sure what song it is because it ain't Dutch.
Are you serious?
I mean, I've slowed it down, I've turned it up, I've got no idea what they're saying.
Oh my god,
And
that's
then they're
funny.
also they're shaving this these women's heads because they apparently slept with the Germans, a scene we do not like. But then,
Yeah, we hate the hair shaving scene.
yeah, they're chanting. They're calling her a dirty whore in Dutch, but it doesn't sound Dutch, so
Yeah.
it loses all meaning for me.
It's so
Horrible.
rough because obviously it happened. I mean, we know that this kind of thing did happen, but it's just so unfortunate because in a lot of these situations, it's kind of like, well, even if this person did, sleep with a German soldier or whatever, how much consent can you infer in a situation where one person is a member of an occupying force and the other person is afraid to say no? So
Right.
it's just so rough. It's like these women kind of forgotten by history and, just had these unfortunate things happen to them. Victimized twice, one might say.
Yeah, it's yesterday there was a news item on the 8 o'clock news here about this resistance woman in Friesland, which is a province in the Netherlands. And she was a member of the resistance, but she was never honored because she apparently had a relationship with a German officer.
Ah,
And yesterday they reinstated her memorial, and she's now remembered, but she died. She was murdered by Germans for being a
oh,
part of the resistance. But it's hard to think about that situation. Even I don't know how far you would go to save your own life or to save your family's lives
right.
in this. Like,
Especially, if there's no end in sight to the occupation and you don't know if this is just life now.
it's very true, and I'm sure the resistance guys weren't all clean either. I mean, they're heroes, but still, it's a war, so stuff is gonna happen that's not all morally right.
Yeah. And it's kind of tough in this particular depiction as well, simply because Hanks and Spielberg are allergic to having women in their shows. No
Call them out.
offense, but it's been getting better as time goes on. But oh boy, you want to see two women have a conversation? Not on HBO, or you don't.
Now, I
So it's
guess,
just we
I
get
guess,
such limited depictions of women, and this happens to be one of them.
yes, it's just a negative one. I do like though that shortly after that scene, there's a scene where Easy Company is on a tank driving into the Noonan, I believe, which is not pronounced that way, but it's how Nixon says it. Um, and how Webster then says, Vincent Van Gogh was born in Neuilly. But I forgot my point. All right. Easy Company is driving into this town on a tank, and they see a woman with a shaved head and a baby, which is obviously a German born baby. And they throw her their lunch or rations, I guess,
Yeah,
which is a nice little. It's almost an apology for the scene before it. It's nice that they then included some sympathy as well for
yeah,
this
absolutely.
woman.
Do you want to talk about your grandfather?
I do. I want to take a little side trip on this pod because you said your grandfather fought in World War II, right?
Yeah.
So mine didn't, and I didn't know very much about my grandfather until recently. I'll start with a little side track because my grandfather died in a car accident in '63. It was like a kind of Final Destination kind of car accident. So
Oof.
it was very, very sudden. And my mum was 13, I believe. They're very young. But so I never met him, obviously. But we recently discovered some interesting facts about his whereabouts during the war. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. So my grandfather, we recently discovered, had an interesting adventure in wartime. He was 19 when there was a war on. He was studying in Wageningen, which is not too far from Arnhem, actually. And when we were looking into his history to try and make a little book about him, we discovered that first he enlisted in the army after the war. So that's where our journey to finding out who he actually was started. We found some service records in the National Archives. And then we also found something else which was really interesting. It was a piece of paper or like a card basically that said he was arrested twice for apparently illegal work. And we
Oh,
had no idea. We had no idea what this means. Like it doesn't say. It says he was imprisoned for illegal work for 3 months. And it ended up, we found out later, it was actually longer than that. But it doesn't detail anything. It just says he was arrested, also found guilty, apparently. So that's all in public record. But of course, when you read stuff like that, it raises all sorts of questions. So we were like, what did he do? Why was he
right.
arrested? My aunt actually went to the National Archives because the first bit we found was public information and they could send it to us by email. But there was more information, they told us, but they weren't allowed to send it because it involved other people. So they're not allowed to, it's not allowed to leave the archives. So my aunt actually went to the National Archives in Amsterdam and found out that my grandfather was not arrested once, but twice. And the first time he was 19, he was studying in Wageningen and he was arrested during a student razzia, which is like a massive operation of arrest, basically, by the Germans.
Oh, wow.
And the day before he was arrested, a big known collaborator to the Germans was murdered. And this man apparently told the Germans that he was murdered by students, and in return, the Germans retaliated and arrested 600 students from all over the country. And my grandfather was one of those.
Oh, no way.
And that's all we know. We don't know anything else. We know the prison he was sent to, but we don't know exactly what happened there. Just that he was released, I think, 2 months later. So he was in the first prison for 2 months. But then when he was released, he wanted to keep on studying. But if you wanted to study during the war, or during the occupation, I should say, you had to sign like a declaration of loyalty to the Germans
Oh, wow.
in order to study. And my grandpa didn't want to do it.
No doubt.
So he I think his brother did because he only had a month left to go in his studies, but my grandfather had like 2 or 3 years still to go, so he didn't want to sign it. But if he didn't sign the declaration, he would be sent to work in Germany in a camp.
Oh, boy.
So my grandfather went into hiding. I found out the house that he went into hiding in, but we don't know anything else about it except that he was arrested because he was ratted out by someone.
Oh,
So,
my God.
and he was arrested with a known resistance man, a not famous resistance man, but still known resistance man in the Dutch resistance on his little arrest thingy, it says that he was arrested for going into hiding, but also possibly for aiding the resistance. And I wish I knew what it was he did, if he did anything, but there's no one left alive to tell the story, so I don't know.
Right. And not exactly one of those situations where people were writing things down.
Right now, there wouldn't be any information, and that's probably also why all these records have to stay in the National Archives, because the name of this resistance guy is on it. So I did a lot of research afterward, and I found him, and he's buried near me. Actually, I haven't been yet, but he died after being imprisoned with my grandfather. So they were sent to this very famous SS prison in Scheveningen, which is near the coast. But it's called the Orange Hotel, famously, because most of the people in prison there were resistance people.
Right.
So he was stuck there for 3 months. And it doesn't sound like very long, but I've seen one of the cells and it's tiny, tiny, tiny. And also, apparently, my cousin was told that during his imprisonment there, he wasn't allowed to lay down or sit down in the cell. So he had to stand for 3 months.
Oh, yeah. Torture.
Yes. And obviously, they would have found ways probably to sit down and lie down, but only when there weren't any guards. So, pretty brutal. I haven't
Yeah.
been yet to the prison. You can go and visit. It's a museum now, so you can go and see. But it's crazy to think that he's been in prison there. And then he was just released. He was pardoned, and we don't know why. And the resistance guy was pardoned as well, but he died a week later, probably because he was badly, badly mistreated in the prison. So it's
Yeah.
a crazy story.
You also kind of wonder if it's one of those situations where, you know, how sometimes the cops will let someone out of jail and then their old friends on the street think that's suspicious and they think that the person is working with the cops now.
Right. And also maybe the cops are trying to see if there's any going back to the resistance and then finding out more people or
Yeah.
stuff like that. Yeah. But there's absolutely no one left alive to talk about this with, which is kind of sad because I really want to know. There's so many gaps. But
Yeah. It's interesting that you were able to find so much information though. That's really cool.
yeah, and I Googled for months to try and find like this guy's family, and I did find them, but most of them are dead because he was a lot older than my grandfather was. So he
Right.
died, and his children are already dead, and I think all of his grandchildren as well, which makes it really difficult to find anyone who's interested and still alive. So I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know if I can ever find out more about this or if this is the end of the story because I keep wanting to write a book about it, but there's only a teeny, teeny, tiny bit of information and there's not too much to go on.
Yeah. Well, it would have to be a novel and you would just have to fill in some of the blanks creatively.
Yeah, I mean, I know we know we can do this, but I
Yeah.
still feel like is that gonna do anyone any good? Is it worth turning it turning it into fiction to tell the story, or is it something you shouldn't do?
I mean, I love reading historical fiction. I think it would be cool.
Yeah. Maybe it'll be my next project. Episode 5 is called Crossroads, and we're still in the Netherlands for this episode. We follow now Captain Winters in his new role as commander of the 2nd Battalion, and we watch the events of the crossroads or the island through his eyes as he recollects what has happened as he writes a report, which is now his new normal.
Yeah, and the format of this episode is very cool. It's one of the reasons why I think it's it ranks really highly if we were to rank the episodes. It's just a really cool format of we're seeing everything that happened through kind of flashbacks as Winters types the report about what happened. And I think formatting it in that way is a really cool way of also framing, we see Winters kill that one soldier again and again. Like we see that clip play a few times. So sort of flashing back over this while he's writing this report is also a really cool way of referencing PTSD and kind of the emotional fallout of having done all those things as well.
And it's also slightly different each time we get to see it, which I think is really interesting. The shot is always slightly different, and it's never quite the same angle, or we get a close up of the boy's face, or we see him as a whole person.
No, for
And
sure.
yeah,
Because memory is not always the same either, right? You remember
right.
something, you tell a story years later, and someone else who was there goes, well, that's not how I remember it. So memory can be faulty and memory can change over time. And as you're recalling it, maybe even as you're retelling the story to someone else, you might unconsciously change certain aspects or whatever. So yeah, it's kind of a cool meditation on memory as well. We also see, so of course, Winters has been promoted, and so he's been replaced as the leader of Easy Company, but that doesn't last very long because their new leader, Moose Heiliger, gets shot by a jumpy sentry. So we end the episode without really knowing I guess the leadership of Easy Company is kind of up in the air.
It is. What's interesting about this episode is that it's partly shot in the dark and we're in a field, so it's not as obvious to see where we are, and I never used to like it because I couldn't recognize my own country in this episode or the previous episode. But I've since been to the island or the crossroads in the Netherlands, and it looks exactly the way it does in the show. I think it's pretty amazing that they've been able to recreate it as well.
Yeah, it is nice to see attention to detail in that way. And the night lighting is really good in this episode, which, man, you would not think that it seems like a low bar, but so often in shows they really want you to know that it's nighttime, and you're like, well, I understand that it's nighttime,
The
but I also have no
Pacific!
idea what's going on. But no, this show does a really good job. Like you can see their faces, you understand what's happening.
I don't like the dark, but I don't mind the dark so much in this episode.
There's some fun little character moments too, not just Winters. I really love the when Winters is sending Joe Liebgott back with the prisoners of war, and he can just tell that Joe is champing at the bit to get a gun on these guys, and he takes his gun and he tells him he only gets one bullet, and that if he shoots any of the POWs, the rest of them will jump him. I really enjoy that scene. It's just, I think, so indicative of who Winters is as a leader. He really kind of sees his guys.
Ross Bacall is just really good in that scene. Like, he just looks so annoyed. Like, what are you
Yeah,
doing? Why are you taking my gun? Yeah. Feel
absolutely.
like I feel like any other leader would have given him a reprimand for being so sassy.
Yeah, for sure. And this is also the episode where we get a good Jimmy Fallon jump scare.
I feel like Jimmy Fallon, to be honest, gets a bad rep because he's pretty good in this episode. It's not
He's
like
fine.
it's not terrible. It only takes you out because he's so well known.
Right. If he hadn't gone on to become Jimmy Fallon, nobody would be pointing out this one guy as being terrible.
Right. And we also get the famous line from the show.
Yes.
You can say it. I'm not gonna say it.
We're paratroopers, Lieutenant. We're supposed to be surrounded. If this were a drinking game, you'd finish your drink right now.
Yes. And we actually get that line right as they head for the stone.
Yeah. And so there's kind of some really cool foreshadowing at the end of this episode because, they see the guys coming away. Babe, I think, and Bill Garnier see the guys coming away, and they're like, holy, like these guys don't look so good.
Now, and you also see Babe shivering as he smokes a cigarette, which is also, I think, another little bit of foreshadowing.
Absolutely. This is a really great sort of this whole episode is a really great character driven episode that because it's so character driven could be potentially less interesting, but it's really not. Like it's such a good bridge between the end of Market Garden and the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, in my opinion.
I agree.
So, moving on to what I would say is maybe one of my favorite episodes, episode 6, Bastogne. This episode, we get thrown right into the Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16th, 1944. And December 16th is my birthday.
What a coincidence.
Yeah. Ominous. So they're thrown into the Battle of the Bulge, and essentially, this is maybe one of the last big gasps of the German army during the war. So this is still big ticket stuff here. And we're seeing it from the point of view of the company medic, which I think is a really interesting choice. And so essentially, the guys are huddled up in the Belgian woods in foxholes, and they're being shelled within an inch of their lives. And we're seeing our medic, Doc Rowe, running around, saving people, going through his own considerable PTSD because obviously there's people that he can't save. It's just a really cool focus of an episode.
Yes. It's also my favorite episode, probably. It's also the first episode I ever made a drawing of. So
Oh, no
that's the
way.
thing. It is, yeah. You know this.
Listen, you've done so much really good Band of Brothers art that I don't recall what came first.
Doc Roken first, in my painting and in my heart.
Yeah. Yeah. It's neat because I feel like in a lot of war media, of course, we don't focus on the medic. People who are maybe traditionally into war media, there's this perception that, people want to see battles and they want to see fighting and they want to see this and that. So the fact that this is such a violent, battle heavy episode, but we're seeing it from the point of view of a non-combatant essentially is a really interesting choice. We also get to kind of follow his emotional journey because essentially he didn't choose to become a medic. They essentially took the gun out of his hand. And after he had signed up and said, great, you're going to go be a medic now. And he's good at it, but it's not his calling. It's not a job that he wanted. It was thrust upon him. And it's obviously heinous to watch all these people die and then having to kind of pick yourself back up and keep going and keep trying to help people, even though at this point in the woods, he's armed with very little. He doesn't have supplies. He doesn't have his scissors.
Like they're all like underdressed. They don't have proper winter clothing. There's not enough food. There's not enough medicine. There's not enough of anything.
Yeah.
And also on top of that, they're being shelled 24/7, pretty much.
Right. Your nervous system never gets a break. You're constantly on the edge.
And also it's cold, so they're probably not getting any sleep or any proper sleep anyway. So like
Right.
sleep
Which of
sleep
course,
deprivation plays its part. And then as a medic you have to walk into the line of fire, basically, into danger instead of away. So
right.
it's just I couldn't even imagine being shot at and then having to go toward the danger instead of away from it.
Right. Exactly. And there's a lot of a lot of this stuff has been said in the fandom and stuff, but just the fact that Doc doesn't use anyone's real names could be seen as him trying to distance himself from these people that he might get to watch die and won't be able to do anything about it.
Right. He doesn't use their nicknames, but there is a nice little thing at the very end when he is in a foxhole with Babe bandaging up his hand that he stepped on, and then
Yeah,
finally calling him Babe. It's like a little bit of relief after being shelled.
right. It's a nice sort of emotional breather at the end of all this terrible stuff and before more terrible stuff.
I mean, it's not. If you think it's foreshadowing, it's not foreshadowing because it's nothing good is gonna happen after that episode.
No.
But they do it very smartly at the end of that scene where you pan away from them and you see like the bloody footprints in the snow. But I think it's pretty smart. And also it's an interesting episode because it ties together some storylines that didn't originally in real life intervene with each other because we get to meet Renee Lemaire, who's a nurse.
Yes, we get to meet a lady who has dialogue, and I'm always excited about that.
I know, and it's very good dialogue as well. She's a very good actress.
Yeah.
But
So
she and Doc Rowe never met in real life, but they might have, which is why we all excuse the fact that they are kind of thrown together.
yes. I mean, she's obviously a great inclusion, I think. And in the background, we also see the character of Anna, whose name in real life was Augusta, who was a nurse, who was
Yes.
also there. So it's cool to kind of see those stories in the background, even though we don't get a huge focus on
I,
it. But it's
yeah. And I do like that Doc actually asks about Anna or Augusta in this case,
yeah,
and asks where she comes from because she's probably the only black person in the show. I think. I don't think
yep,
I've seen any other people of color.
yeah, correct,
Um, it's it's only a small mention, but at least it's mentioned.
yeah.
I've been to Bastogne 3 times now on tour. And I've been to the foxholes and I've seen all the places. It's not a lot that's still there, but it's interesting to go there, and it's a strange feeling to be in those woods in the Broazac. Um, it's a cultivated forest, so it doesn't look very natural, but the foxes are still there. And on one of the tours, we went very early in the morning before sunrise. So it was like misty and spooky, and I swear you could hear like the air talk.
This is another one of those moments in the show where if you are not really paying attention, you don't have a great sense of the passage of time. The Siege of Bastogne only lasted 8 days, I think. And obviously there were things going on around that, the taking of Foy, which we get to later, and Novel Rachon. Like there's other things going on that happened before and after. But the actual Siege of Bastogne itself was only 8 days. And I'm
Right.
sure it seemed way longer because they didn't have the clothes and the ammunition and the food and all that stuff.
To me, it always feels like in the other episodes, it feels like stuff goes by in a flash, even though some of those operations take either days or at least a day. And it's
Yeah.
like 2 minutes on screen and then it's done. It's interesting, but for Bastogne, it's probably the other way around. It feels like that they're much longer than they actually were. And
Yeah,
it's still
there's
it's like in the midst of winter, like we get Christmas and probably I think they were there until into the new year, right? I believe.
well, I mean, they were still in the area, yeah, but
Right.
the
Yeah.
siege itself was done, yeah. Yeah, and
Right.
we had kinda talked about kind of tied into that, the fact that this, you know, relatively short span of time felt long and terrifying, but also somehow, like, monotonous, and, we had talked about the sort of subplot of Doc Rowe looking for scissors for half the episode, and it's kind of like the mundane and a high stakes situation.
Yes. And it's all kind of funny, even like his conversation with Bill Garnier, who has a probably like a urine tract infection or something like that.
Yeah,
And it's just such a funny conversation, even though they're in hell. They still
right.
get to, yeah, they still get to talk about funny stuff, and there's some singing, and there's lots of stuff going on in this episode, even though they're in the same place the entire time.
We're in Adele.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, you're right. Like day-to-day stuff is still happening. You're still having your ordinary conversations. You just happen to be getting shelled within an inch of your life at the same time.
And probably Winter's just shaving, I think, in this episode as well. Is it this episode or the next one?
It's the beginning of this one.
Right.
Oh my
We also
goodness. When
get
I was gonna say when I tell you I'd be growing the biggest, bushiest beard, like you could not pay me to shave with that cold water where you have to literally break the ice on the surface of it. Hard pass.
I know. I know, and I didn't understand before, but apparently it's regulation to have a shaved face.
I mean, whatever, court martial day. I'm growing a beard. It'll be warmer.
And the opposite of him is really just Nixon, uh, being woken up by some higher ups and looking like he was just having a comfortable sleep for once.
Oh gosh. You know what? Anytime I wake up hungover, I always think to myself, it could be worse. It could be Nixon in a hole in the ground during World War II. Obviously, this whole episode was filmed on a soundstage, but you can't really tell. I mean, once you know, you can kind of, but you really can't, unless you knew that. I don't think you would know.
No, I never. It never takes me out of it. Like the only difference between the Bojack on screen and the Bojack in real life in the snow. I've seen it in the snow. There's not much of a difference. The only difference is that the foxholes are further apart. Like there's way more space between them, but that doesn't work if you want to make a movie.
Why
Still
do
my
you think this
favorite.
episode is so popular?
I think part of it is probably down to Shane Taylor's performance as Doc Brown. I think it's just amazing. And it's also maybe one of the less action packed episodes. I want to say maybe. I don't know. Do you have
Yeah.
any idea why you think it's so popular?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. It is very focused on one character. So we kind of get to sit with them and spend a lot of time with them. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think what you said is right as well. I think obviously there's some really I think the show on the whole, there are some really dynamite performances, but obviously, Shane Taylor really carried this one. Well, I think he really behaves in a way that all of us would hope that we would react if we were in a situation where, you thought you were going to fight, someone takes your gun away and decides you're going to be a medic, and then you just have to kind of step up and you have to like imagine before you get over there and you have some training, but you're not a doctor.
Yeah,
And
right.
you know that if you fall down on the job and don't remember your training, there's very real consequences for other people. So just a huge amount of stress. And I think the way he responds is that's the ideal. That's the way I think we all hope that we would respond in that situation by stepping up and,
Right.
going above and beyond.
I feel like he's everybody's safety blanket a little bit. Everybody feels safe knowing that Dark Rose coming. Kind of like
Right. Yeah.
that. And I don't know, there's one scene that always breaks my heart. It's when Winters tells him that he needs to get off the line. Then we cut to the stone absolutely being barraged by bombs. And it's just one thing after the other for Doc Brown. Just he doesn't get any breaks in this entire episode.
Absolutely. And then when he finds out that Renee's been killed and he takes
Ah,
her handkerchief, and then at the end he ends up having to use the handkerchief to bandage up a wound, it's never stops.
I know, it's just brutal. But you can see him kind of think about that moment when he has to use it to bandage up Babe's hand. And he thinks, this is what she would have done or wanted, or you can see him think it. Kind of
Yeah,
funny. And that's where the episode ends. And we think maybe we get a little bit of a break. But then there's episode 7.
episode 7 is called The Breaking Point, and it sure feels that way when you're watching it.
Sure does.
In my notes for the recap of this episode, I've written snow hell,
And
because this episode is, I believe we get narration, right? This is the episode that narrates,
we
Lipton.
do.
And so he's kind of the de facto leader of Easy Company because their actual CEO, Norman Dyke, is not particularly useful. And so it's kind of his perspective while they're being shelled within an inch of their lives again. We see just a lot of brutal violence. We see characters die. We see characters be seriously injured. And at the end of the episode, we see Spears take over as the leader of Easy Company during the taking of Foy. So in this episode, we obviously get a lot of focus on Lipton, who really kind of holds the group together. He's the emotional core.
He is one of my favorite characters as well, I think. And
Oh,
also, he's a
cool.
boy band member, so double bonus.
Yeah. Yeah, we also get some focus on obviously Dyke as another character who, like Cobb, kind of becomes I don't want to say antagonist, but you know what I mean? Kind of like a fall guy in the show.
Yes, I am. I do wonder how much of that is actually what happened versus like an instrument to show that there are shitty leaders and there's good leaders.
Right. And the whole military hierarchy of commissioned officers versus non-commissioned officers, and the fact that we can all see that Lipton obviously is the leader of Easy Company, whether he's a commissioned officer or not, but he can't be promoted in that way. And so we end up with this
Right.
guy who's, not fit for the job, but there's nothing that Winters can really do about it.
No. And they talk about that in the course of the episode as well. Like I believe Lipton goes to Winters and tells on Dyke a little bit. And then Winters discusses this with Nixon and says, really are no good leaders. I've got no options.
Right.
And then Lieutenant Peacock gets sent home because he's apparently irrational or something. I don't really remember. But he
Oh,
gets kind of that, he gets the lottery, right? He gets the luck of the draw, gets to go home.
well, yeah, Nix wins the lottery and then gives his trip home away to Peacock, which to help solve at least one of Winters' problems, which is that he has all these platoon leaders who are not necessarily great at their job.
Right. And it's interesting for Peacock because I never really realized that he wasn't competent as much until, and I'm going very briefly back to the replacements episode. When they're about to jump into the Netherlands, he has a conversation with Maartje, I believe, where he says, when the light comes on and I have to jump, just tap me, all right? Just tell me to go. And I always thought that maybe he was like colorblind or something, but apparently it's meant to show that he's scared to jump.
Yeah.
Which I guess if you put all the things he does together, it makes him sort of an incompetent leader, but I feel like he's the least incompetent of all of them.
Well, I mean, he appears to not really be able to read a map either. But I mean, this is all this is all part of, things that get tied into a narration later. I mean, I don't know how
Yeah,
much
I
is
feel
true.
like that's an easy company problem too, not being able to read maps.
Yeah, some of that going around. And then Easy Company does have one good commissioned officer in the form of Buck Compton, as they say, but unfortunately, he goes through quite a lot in this episode, loses all of his friends, and is not really in good shape afterwards.
No, that's another little PTSD moment there.
Yeah, I like that they show this stuff. I know that for some of the veterans, they thought it was not, they didn't necessarily like that depiction because there's this sense that if you're not the stoic, stiff upper lip guy all the time, then that's a display of weakness. But honestly, I'd be surprised if you got through all of that stuff without having some kind of emotional reaction. So I was really glad that they did show that in the show, and they showed that it happened to even the most competent, the best leaders, no one really was spared.
Right, not even Winters.
Right.
Like, and with Compton, you see it in the episode in the Netherlands as well when they're watching a movie, and he's just staring into space. When Winters is talking to him, and you can kind of see it coming, but then here he actually breaks.
Yeah. And I think that if you haven't been in a situation like that, it's easy maybe to think that you would react a certain way, but you just don't know. And it has nothing to do with how strong you are or how brave or whatever. We all just have, as human beings, we're really not meant to go through that level of brutality in a short period of
Right,
time.
right. Like, I don't know who says it in the show, but war is hell. I think it's Welsh that says that.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. And even before Buck loses his friends, he's kind of obviously having a reaction to having been wounded. And I think as someone we learn from his various conversations that he was a college boy, he was an athlete. And there's something to be said for you get wounded and all of a sudden your body doesn't do what you tell it to do. And
Right.
that's huge. I mean, if that's not something you've ever encountered before, of course that's going to have an impact on your psyche. So,
Yes. It's probably the one thing he like in his life would always be able to rely on, and then suddenly that's gone. So
yeah, of
that's
course.
yeah. And also everyone around you's dying. So there's nothing really.
Right. And this is an era where really a huge part of your masculinity and who you are as a man is your physical strength and how well you can do this and that and whatever. So to get wounded and all of a sudden you can't be that guy for a little while, that's tough. And then obviously he comes back and all kinds of terrible things happen. Garnier and Toy get hit, Skip and Pencala get hit. Malarkey is having a terrible time as well. He's losing his friends. Hoobler dies in this episode. So it's quite the emotional punch.
Yes, it's like one hit after another. Like it doesn't stop.
Yeah, and I in my notes I wrote the church scene at the end. I called it the dead guy summary because
Hmm.
we see them all sitting in the church, and then they slowly like fade away into ghosts as the narration talks about which ones are no longer around.
Sometimes I forget these were real men. It's
Yeah,
so
and
brutal to think about them losing all their friends like that.
like young as well. I mean, I we're in our mid working on late 30s now. And people like friends of the family, whatever. So you encounter a young man who's 20 years old, and that's young, man. Holy.
I know. That's kids, basically.
Hmm.
I don't want to
I,
offend any 20-year-olds, but still, they're
I mean,
kids.
I didn't have my shit together at age 20. I'll tell you that right now. I was not the
Oh,
person that I am today.
I didn't even know how to tie my shoes at 20. So it's like, how do you even go to war and face all these horrible situations? I
Right.
don't even.
Oh, super quickly, did we want to talk about the music?
We can certainly talk about the music. As I listened to the music right before we started this podcast, what do you think about the music? You go first.
Oh, well, I think we had talked about in Spears's big hero scene where he's taking over as the commander during the taking of Foy. There's some music that really, I guess, contributes to the atmosphere of the scene in that one.
You mean Captain America, right?
Yeah, he's basically in Spears' Captain America scene. The music is delightful. 5 stars.
Very much. And then so is the theme music in general. It's really good. And I've been comparing this theme to like the Pacific Masters of the Air. And there's something about this one that's it just hits every time. I cannot skip the intro ever.
I do like the theme music for this one, although I would say it's not as good as the Pacific.
I would agree with you, but that might also be because the intro to the Pacific with like video and the effects are just as a whole slightly better than this one.
Right. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think I mean we'll get to this later too, but the in the episode Why We Fight, it starts and ends with music as well. So there are definitely some sound design elements in here that are cool. So today we talked about episodes 4 through 7, and next episode we are going to focus on episodes 8 through 10, and that will conclude our Band of Brothers series. After which we will probably do a movie just to keep things moving along.
That sounds like a good plan. If you like, this was the excellent first show to discuss, but also people kind of maybe know how we feel about Band Brothers, and they might not know how we feel about all these other movies that we've got to watch.
Yeah. So I'm excited. We definitely have a long list of things that we would like to cover and all different kinds of stuff as well. I definitely want to touch on some content about women in World War II, of course. So we'll definitely kind of branch out a little bit.
Speaking of branching out, are you reading anything?
So since the last time we spoke, I finished a book that is not, it wasn't about World War II, but it's kind of adjacent. So it's called Blowback, and it's about American foreign policy since the end of World War II. And the author is a professor who is an expert in Japan. So quite a lot of the book is about sort of how the Americans dealt with the Japanese in World War II and then what came after. And so again, not totally World War II, but really kind of interesting about how World War II shaped the rest of the century, essentially.
That sounds cool. What have you learned from that book?
This is not going to maybe go over well with American listeners, but America really fumbled the ball quite a lot with its foreign policy in the back half of the 20th century. And I won't get into it too much, but there's the author does a really good job of sort of constructing this narrative of all the different ways that the US tried to maintain its quote unquote empire in East Asia, in South America, even with NATO in Europe. It was a really interesting read. I think that, and I mean, this book was kind of famous to begin with because it was published in, I believe, 1999 or 2000. And then it essentially predicted 9/11. I mean,
Oh
based on
man,
American
yeah.
foreign policy, the author was like, yeah, there's going to be a terrorist attack. There's going to be XYZ. And then it happened, of course. And there's, various other international relations things that have happened since that kind of get alluded to in the book as a possibility. And so it was really interesting to read because it helps you put the pieces together of how things come to be. I think lots of times our governments do things in our names that we don't necessarily get the full picture of what's being done, what's happening, why it's being done, what the impacts are on other people. So it's a really neat read, but like with anything nonfiction, I like to follow it up with something that's maybe a little different, a palate cleanser. So I've just started a book on survival in the Canadian wilderness.
Excellent. I could not relate to any of this. Like, if I were to get stuck in the Canadian wilderness, I would die.
Well, a lot of people would die actually because a lot of people don't have survival skills. So don't feel bad
But
about
then
that.
I guess maybe I wouldn't die because I would know you, and then I would call you and be like, Sam, I need your help.
Yeah, you're still reading the same thing you were reading last time, I guess.
I am at the same page, at the same word.
But that's okay. You're taking in the subject matter. You're really marinating in it.
Exactly.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. We really appreciate it. We would love it if you would continue to listen. And as always, if you have any questions for us, we do now have an Instagram account, Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. So if you want to give us a follow or drop us a line, that would be cool.
And we will answer your questions whenever we're recording.
Yes. Bye.